One moment, my granddaughter Lily was there, her laughter like sunshine itself. The next, just silence. They said I was careless, negligent. My own daughter's grief-stricken words painted me as the one to blame. For 7 years, their story became my prison, their lie, my reality. But some truths are far more devastating to stay buried forever, and some secrets are far more monstrous than anyone could imagine. What were they really hiding?
Before the silence, before the whispers turned into shouts, my life in Willow Creek was a gentle rhythm, a predictable melody played out in the quiet aisles of the library where I'd spent my career, and then, in retirement, in the sun-dappled corners of my small garden. But the sweetest notes were always those of Lily, my granddaughter. At 6 years old, she was a whirlwind of bright curiosity and infectious giggles, her hand always so trusting in mine. Her mother, my daughter Sarah, well, Sarah was still finding her way, even in her late 20s. Our relationship was a tapestry woven with love, certainly, but also with threads of a quiet concern on my part, a feeling that her youthful impulsiveness sometimes overshadowed her responsibilities. Still, Lily was our shared sun, the center around which both our worlds revolved, or so I believed. My days were measured in story times, scraped knees kissed better, and the comforting weight of her small body curled against mine as we read her favorite tales. I was content, my world neatly arranged, my heart full. I had plans, simple ones, of watching her grow, of teaching her to bake my mother's cookies, of seeing her off to her first day of proper school. Little dreams, but they were everything. The day it all shattered began like any other late autumn afternoon in Ohio, the air crisp, the leaves a riot of gold and crimson underfoot. Lily had been especially lively, her cheeks flushed rosavam, from chasing squirrels in the park, her laughter echoing off the ancient oaks. I remember thinking how perfect it all was, a snapshot of happiness I'd carry with me. Sarah had called earlier, her voice a little strained, asking if I could keep Lily a bit longer that afternoon. She had an urgent errand, something about a meeting with a new client for her fledgling freelance graphic design work. It sounded important, a step forward for her, so I'd readily agreed. We were near the old bandstand, Lily collecting fallen acorns. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to fit just one more into her already bulging pockets. My phone buzzed then. It was Sarah again, her voice now tight, almost breathless, asking if I could run a quick, unexpected errand for her on my way home. Pick up a specific art supply she'd forgotten and desperately needed for that client. It was a little out of the way, but she sounded so stressed, I said of course. I told Lily to stay right by the bench, that Grandma would be just a moment making a call to check the store's closing time. Just a moment. That's what I told her. That's what I told myself. I turned my back for what couldn't have been more than 2 minutes, my attention diverted by the call, confirming the art shop's hours. When I turned back, the park bench was empty. Lily was gone. At first, it was a flicker of annoyance. She knew better than to wander off. Lily, I called. Out. My voice still light, expecting her to pop out from behind a tree, her eyes sparkling with mischief. But the park was suddenly, unnervingly still. The playful shouts of other children seemed to recede, replaced by a roaring in my own ears. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw its way up my throat. I circled the bandstand, my calls growing louder, more frantic. Lily. Lily. My eyes scanned every bush, every shadow, every distant figure. Nothing. Just the rustling leaves and the lengthening shadows that seemed to mock my rising terror. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed her whole, leaving not a trace. I don't know how long I searched, running in widening circles, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Other parents began to notice, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. Someone called the police, I remember sinking to my knees by that empty bench, the rough wood cold beneath my trembling hands, a primal scream building inside me. And then Sarah arrived. I saw her striding across the grass, her face a mask of something I couldn't yet name. Not just fear, something harder. She didn't run to me, didn't ask what happened with the frantic desperation of a mother whose child was missing. Instead, she stopped a few feet away, her eyes, usually so like mine, now cold and accusing as they swept over me. The first police officer was just approaching us, his notebook out. Before he could even ask a question, before I could fully form the words to explain the inexplicable, Sarah's voice cut through the air, sharp and weighted with a terrible finality. "Mom, what did you do?" she said, her voice loud enough for the officer, for everyone to hear. "Where is my daughter?" "You were supposed to be watching her." The officer's gaze, initially sympathetic towards me, an obviously distressed older woman, visibly shifted. He looked from Sarah's tear-streaked, accusing face back to me, and I saw the first seed of doubt, of suspicion, being planted. My world, which had been teetering on the brink, began its dizzying, unstoppable collapse. I tried to speak, to explain the phone call, the brief moment I'd looked away, but my words came out as a choked sob, a garbled mess of terror and disbelief. Sarah's accusations, however, were clear, precise, delivered with a chilling certainty. She painted a picture of me being perhaps a little forgetful lately, a little overwhelmed, subtle at first, then more direct. She implied I hadn't been myself, that maybe I wasn't up to the task of caring for a lively 6-year-old. Her then-boyfriend Mark, who arrived shortly after, a silent, brooding presence, just nodded gravely at her words, his arm around her shoulder, a portrait of a supportive partner comforting a grieving mother whose own parent had failed her. It was a performance, I see that now, a meticulously crafted scene. But in that moment of raw shock and horror, it was devastatingly effective. The park, once a place of joy, transformed into a crime scene, and I was, almost instantly, its primary suspect. The questions from the police, initially gentle, became more pointed, more probing. My confusion, my inability to offer a coherent explanation beyond the horrifying truth that Lily had vanished under my care, was twisted, reinterpreted. Was I hiding something? Had there been an accident I was afraid to admit? The hours blurred into a nightmarish sequence of interrogations, of bewildered stares from people I'd known my whole life, of the dawning, sickening realization that my daughter, my own flesh and blood, was not just grieving, but actively pointing a finger at me. The local news crews arrived, their cameras like vultures, their questions like barbs. The narrative was set before I even truly understood what was happening. The elderly grandmother, perhaps past her prime, responsible for the tragic disappearance of her beloved grandchild. That night, and in the days that followed, the life I knew was systematically dismantled. My home, once a sanctuary, felt like a fishbowl, with reporters camped outside and neighbors peering through their curtains. The carefully tended garden withered, unnoticed. Sleep offered no escape, only replays of that horrifying moment, Lily's smiling face dissolving into an empty space. Friends I'd shared decades with became distant, their calls less frequent, their voices strained with an uncomfortable pity that felt worse than outright accusation. Sarah, shielded by Mark, refused to speak to me directly, her grief, as portrayed to the world, too profound to bear the presence of the one who had supposedly caused it. The silence from her was a heavier blow than any shouted accusation. It was a cold, hard wall, confirming my new status as an outcast, a pariah. The official charge, when it came, felt like both a shock and an inevitability: criminal negligence. They weren't saying I'd intentionally harmed Lily, not yet, but that my carelessness, my lapse, had directly led to her vanishing, to what everyone increasingly, sorrowfully presumed was her death. The weight of it was crushing. How do you defend yourself against a moment, a terrible, irreversible moment of distraction that you yourself replayed 1,000,000 times, each time with a fresh wave of self-recrimination? But beneath the guilt and the grief, a tiny, cold ember of something else began to glow. A bewildered sense of profound injustice. Sarah's immediate, unwavering certainty of my culpability, the way Mark seemed to manage her every response, the subtle inconsistencies in her story about that urgent client meeting that I only began to piece together later, it all felt wrong. But my voice was lost, drowned out by the louder, more compelling story of a heartbroken mother and a negligent grandmother. I remember standing in the courtroom, a place I'd only ever seen on television. The faces around me, a blur of judgment and morbid curiosity. Sarah was on the stand, a figure of perfect, tragic sorrow. Her testimony was a masterpiece of implication, painting me as loving, yes, but increasingly frail, forgetful, perhaps not always safe. Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of my old life. Mark sat behind her, his expression one of solemn support, occasionally dabbing at her arm with a handkerchief. There was no malice in her portrayal, which made it all the more damning. It was presented as a painful, reluctant truth. I wanted to scream, to tell them about the phone call, about Sarah's strange insistence, about the feeling that something was orchestrated. But my lawyer had advised a quiet, remorseful demeanor. Remorse for what, I wasn't sure, beyond the universal remorse of any loving grandmother whose grandchild had vanished on her watch. The community, Willow Creek, the place I'd called home for over 60 years, turned its back. The whispers were a constant hum. Poor Eleanor, she must be devastated, but really at her age, or worse. Do you think could she have? My character, built over a lifetime of quiet service and gentle interactions, evaporated. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the kind librarian, the loving grandmother. I was the woman who lost Lily, the woman whose carelessness, or perhaps something more sinister, had stolen a child from the world. The weight of that new identity was unbearable. It clung to me like a shroud, suffocating, inescapable. The garden I loved became a symbol of all I had lost, untended, overgrown, a mirror of the desolation in my heart. Looking back, it's the speed of it all that still takes my breath away. The speed with which Lily disappeared. The speed with which Sarah accused me. The speed with which the world condemned me. It was as if a script had been written, and everyone knew their lines except me. I was cast as the villain in a tragedy I didn't understand. A tragedy whose true author remained hidden in the shadows. The doors of my old life slammed shut, one by one, leaving me in a cold, dark corridor of accusation and loss, with only the faintest, most stubborn flicker of a question. Why? Why would Sarah do this? The answer, I knew even then, in some deep, unacknowledged part of my soul, was far more complex and far more terrible than simple grief or a lapse in my own attention. That was just the beginning of the silence, the long, agonizing silence that would define the next 7 years of my life. The initial shock numbed me, a merciful buffer against the full force of the horror. But as the days turned into weeks, and the search for Lily yielded nothing but fading hope and mounting speculation against me, the numbness receded, leaving behind a raw, gaping wound. Every morning I'd wake with a fleeting moment of blissful ignorance. Then the reality would crash down. Lily was gone, and I was to blame. That was the narrative. That was the truth everyone accepted. My small home became a cell before I ever saw the inside of an actual one, the silence within its walls deafening, broken only by the occasional, unwelcome ring of a journalist or the hushed, pitying tones of the few who dared to make contact. The local paper ran a timeline, a map of the park, my photo alongside a tearful one of Sarah. I was the focal point of a tragedy, the unwilling star of a nightmare. The sheer injustice of it, the subtle wrongness of Sarah's too quick condemnation, began to fester, a small, hard knot of resentment deep within the overwhelming grief. The trial itself was a blur, a surreal pageant of grief and legalese. My lawyer, a court-appointed public defender named Mr. Davies, was a young man, earnest but clearly outmaneuvered by the prosecution and the palpable public sentiment against me. He tried in his way to present me as a heartbroken grandmother, a victim of a tragic, inexplicable event, but the narrative woven by Sarah, bolstered by Mark's stoic presence at her side, was far more compelling. They painted a picture of a loving but increasingly unreliable caregiver, someone whose age was perhaps catching up with her, whose mind might wander. There was no outright malice in their portrayal of me, which somehow made it even more insidious, more believable to the jury. It was all couched in sorrow, in reluctant admissions of my lapses. Sarah would dab her eyes, her voice would break, and the jury would look at me with a mixture of pity and condemnation. How could they not? Here was a young mother, robbed of her child, pointing, however sorrowfully, at the person last seen with her. I remember the prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman named Ms. Albright, her voice cutting and precise. She didn't need to shout. Her questions were scalpels, dissecting every moment of that afternoon. Every past instant Sarah had reluctantly recalled, where I might have seemed a bit off, a bit forgetful. The phone call from Sarah, the one that had drawn my attention, away from Lily, was presented as a daughter's reasonable request, my subsequent distraction as a clear dereliction of duty. My own memories, my own insistence that something felt orchestrated, that Sarah's demeanor had been strangely calm before the storm of her public grief, were dismissed as the ramblings of a confused, guilt-ridden old woman. Each day in court was another layer of my old self stripped away, another coat of infamy applied. The faces in the gallery, once familiar, now seemed alien, their eyes holding a morbid fascination or a cold judgment. Even the few who might have harbored private doubts stayed silent, unwilling to stand against the tide of public opinion. The verdict, when it came, was no surprise, yet it landed with the force of a physical blow, knocking the remaining air from my lungs. Guilty. Criminal negligence resulting in the disappearance and presumed death of Lily Vance. The judges. Words about the sanctity of a child's life, about the responsibility of those entrusted with their care, washed over me. I saw Sarah collapse into Mark's arms, her sobs echoing through the silent courtroom. It was a performance of utter devastation, and for a moment, a hideous, twisted moment, I almost believed it myself. Perhaps I was the monster they'd made me out to be. Perhaps my memory, my sanity, had indeed failed me so catastrophically. The seed of self-doubt, so expertly planted, took root in the fertile ground of my grief and confusion. 7 years. That was the sentence. 7 years for a moment of distraction, for a crime I hadn't committed in the way they portrayed, for a disappearance that felt, in the deepest recesses of my soul, profoundly, terribly wrong. Walking out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the flashes of cameras blinding me. The shouted questions of reporters, a meaningless cacophony, was the beginning of a different kind of death. The death of Eleanor Vance, respected member of Willow Creek. The birth of Eleanor Vance, prisoner number 74652. The transition to prison life was brutal, a stark, unyielding reality that bore no resemblance to the ordered quiet of my former existence. The clang of steel doors, the harsh fluorescent lights, the constant noise, the loss of every small freedom, it was an assault on the senses, on the spirit. My world shrank to the confines of a small cell, a narrow cot, and the drab, impersonal, uniform that stripped me of my identity, as surely as the verdict had stripped me of my name. The other inmates, a mix of hardened criminals and women as lost and broken as I felt, largely left me alone. I was the baby killer, or so the whispers went, a label that afforded me a certain grim isolation even within those crowded walls. In those early days, the grief for Lily was a living thing, a constant ache in my chest that made breathing difficult. I replayed that afternoon in the park endlessly, searching for a clue, a missed sign, anything that might explain how my bright, vibrant granddaughter could simply vanish. But intertwined with that grief was the gnawing, insidious tendril of Sarah's betrayal. I wrote to her, desperate letters filled with my sorrow for Lily, but also with my bewilderment, my pleas for understanding. I asked her why she had been so quick to condemn me, why her story felt so rehearsed. The letters went unanswered. Mark, I later learned through a curt, formal note from his lawyer, was screening all her correspondence. She was too fragile, he claimed, to endure any contact with me. Fragile. The word was a bitter irony, given the strength she had displayed in systematically destroying my life. Her silence was a confirmation, a deliberate severing of our bond, and it cut deeper than any prison sentence. The years in prison crawled by, each day a monotonous repetition of the last. I found a grim sort of solace in the prison library, a pale imitation of the one I had loved, but a sanctuary nonetheless. Books became my only companions, words my only escape. I read everything I could get my hands on, not just for distraction, but with a strange, burgeoning focus, as if searching for answers in the stories of others, for patterns of deceit, for tales of injustice. The other inmates, with their own harrowing stories of betrayal and misfortune, inadvertently taught me much about the darker sides of human nature, about manipulation and survival. I learned to be quiet, to observe, to listen to the undercurrents of unspoken truths that flowed beneath the surface of prison life. The naivete that had characterized Eleanor Vance of Willow Creek was slowly, painfully being burned away, replaced by a harder, more cynical resolve. My physical world had shrunk, but in a strange way, my internal world began to expand, or at least to sharpen. The initial fog of shock and self-doubt started to lift, replaced by a cold, clear anger. Not a hot, impulsive rage, but a slow-burning, meticulous fury. The inconsistencies in Sarah's account of that day, her peculiar calm during that urgent phone call just before Lily disappeared, the almost too perfect timing of Mark's appearance and his seamless assumption of control over Sarah's narrative, these details, once buried under grief, now rose to the surface, demanding scrutiny. I had too much time to think, too much time to dissect every word, every glance, every silence from that period. The story they had presented to the world, the story that had convicted me, began to feel less like a tragic accident and more like a carefully constructed lie. But who would believe me? I was a convicted criminal, a grandmother who had failed in the most fundamental way. The loss of Lily remained the central, unbearable pain. I mourned her with every fiber of my being. I imagined her growing up, her smile, the sound of her voice. The prison authorities, in a rare moment of something approaching compassion, allowed me to keep one small, faded photograph of her, a picture taken on her 5th birthday, her eyes bright with excitement. That photograph became my talisman, my reason to keep breathing, to keep fighting against the despair that threatened to engulf me. It was a reminder of what had been stolen, not just from me, but from Lily herself. And with that reminder came a growing, unshakable conviction that the truth of her disappearance was still out there, buried under layers of deceit, and that somehow, someday, I had to find it. Not just for my own vindication, but for Lily. She deserved more than to be a ghost in a story manufactured to serve someone else's selfish desires. The prison walls were high, the gates locked, but they could not confine my thoughts. They could not extinguish the ember of suspicion that had begun to glow within me. Sarah's face, as she'd accused me in the park, her eyes cold and hard, not filled with the frantic terror I would have expected. That image became seared into my memory. It was the first crack in the facade, the first clue that the grieving mother was a role she had perhaps rehearsed, and Mark, always there, a shadow behind her, his expression unreadable, his control absolute. What had they stood to gain? Why go to such extraordinary lengths to frame me, her own mother? The questions circled endlessly, fueling a resolve that surprised even myself. The Eleanor who had walked into prison, broken and bewildered, was slowly being replaced by someone else, someone harder, someone who was beginning to understand that the only way out of this nightmare was to fight. The isolation was profound. No visits from Sarah, of course. My few remaining acquaintances from Willow Creek had long since faded away, perhaps out of discomfort, perhaps out of belief in my guilt. My small world consisted of the drab gray walls, the indifferent faces of guards, and the hushed, often sorrowful stories of my fellow inmates. There were days when the despair was a physical weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to draw breath. But then I would look at Lily's photograph, her innocent, trusting gaze, and the anger, the need for truth, would surge anew. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the little girl whose laughter had been silenced, whose future had been erased. The shadow of suspicion that had ruined my life was long and dark, but I began to feel, with a certainty that defied logic, that there was a deeper, more sinister shadow lurking just beyond it, and that my daughter was standing right in the heart of it. The daily indignities of prison life, the loss of autonomy, the constant surveillance, stripped away any remaining pretense or politeness. I learned to be wary, to guard my thoughts and emotions. The softness that had defined me was being calcified, layer by layer, into something more resilient. I observed the power dynamics, the subtle cruelties, the rare acts of kindness. I saw how easily narratives could be manipulated, how reputations could be destroyed or fabricated within those walls, just as mine had been in the world outside. It was a harsh education, but a necessary one. If I was ever to uncover what truly happened to Lily, I would need more than just grief and a sense of injustice. I would need strength, cunning, and an unshakable belief in my own, albeit buried, instincts. The shadow of their accusation had almost extinguished me, but in its depths, a different kind of Eleanor was beginning to stir. During my third year, inside, a small, almost insignificant event nudged the embers of my suspicion into a more active flicker. A new inmate arrived in our block, a woman named Brenda. She was older like me, but world-weary in a way I was only just beginning to comprehend, her eyes holding a lifetime of seeing through deceptions. Brenda wasn't a violent criminal, but a con artist, a mistress of manipulation who'd finally been caught one too many times. She kept to herself mostly, but one day in the dreary common room, she overheard me quietly talking to myself, or perhaps to Lily's photograph, recounting for the 100th time the details of that awful day. The inconsistencies that plagued me. Most inmates steered clear of me, the supposed baby killer. But Brenda just listened, her expression unreadable. When I trailed off, lost in the painful labyrinth of my memories, she spoke, her voice raspy but surprisingly gentle. "Your daughter," she said, not looking at me directly, but at some distant point on the grimy wall. "She sounds like a piece of work. Some people, honey, will burn down the whole world to get what they want, even if it's their own kin they're torching." Her words, casual as they were, struck me with the force of a revelation. Until then, my suspicions about Sarah had been formless, a dark, shapeless dread I couldn't quite articulate even to myself. I'd been so consumed by grief for Lily, and by the sheer overwhelming injustice of my own conviction, that I hadn't allowed myself to truly consider the depths to which Sarah might have sunk. But Brenda, with her lifetime of navigating the underbelly of human behavior, had voiced the unspeakable so matter-of-factly. It was as if she'd given me permission to consider the truly monstrous possibility that Sarah's actions weren't just a panicked, grief-stricken reaction, but something calculated, something deliberate. She always wanted things easy, I found myself confiding in Brenda, the words tumbling out. And Mark, her boyfriend, he always seemed to be pulling the strings. Brenda just nodded slowly. There's always a Mark, she'd said cryptically. Someone whispering poison in their ear, or someone they're trying to please. That conversation with Brenda, brief as it was, became a turning point. It didn't provide answers, but it validated the tiny, persistent voice of doubt that had refused to be silenced within me. I began to look at the details of Lily's disappearance, not just as a tragedy I was unfairly blamed for, but as a potential crime with a hidden perpetrator. I started to mentally reconstruct Sarah's life leading up to that day. Her increasing complaints about the responsibilities of motherhood, her talk of wanting to travel and be free, her growing infatuation with Mark, who, I recalled with a new clarity, had always seemed vaguely impatient, almost dismissive whenever Lily was around. He was ambitious, image-conscious, and Lily, with her innocent demands and a child's natural messiness, hadn't fit into the sleek, unencumbered life he seemed to envision for himself and Sarah. Had Lily become an inconvenience? A roadblock to Sarah's desired future with him? The thought was so vile, so unnatural, that my mind recoiled, yet it persisted, fueled by Brenda's cynical wisdom and my own burgeoning, desperate need for a truth that made more sense than the one I'd been force-fed. The prison library, my grim sanctuary, became my research lab. I read about cases of parental abduction, of falsified identities, of people who simply vanished, sometimes with the complicity of those closest to them. I learned about the ways people could disappear and the reasons why. Each story, each case, file I devoured in the tattered true crime books, added another layer to my understanding of how far people would go for money, for a new life, or to escape an unwanted responsibility. The knowledge was sickening, but also empowering. It armed me with possibilities, however dark. My focus shifted from simply mourning my lost freedom to actively preparing for the day I would be released. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my first task would be to find out what really happened to Lily, and who was truly responsible for the silence that had engulfed her. The remaining years of my sentence were spent in this state of quiet, focused preparation. I exercised, forcing my aging body to stay as strong as possible. I honed my observational skills, watching the intricate dynamics of prison life, learning to read the subtle cues in people's behavior. I saved every tiny scrap of information from the outside world that trickled in, every mention of Willow Creek, every snippet of news that might, however peripherally, relate to Sarah or Mark. They had moved, I learned through a brief, reluctant conversation with a former neighbor I'd managed to contact via a heavily monitored prison phone call. Sold Sarah's small house and bought a larger one in Northwood, a more affluent town about an hour away. Doing very well for themselves, the neighbor had said, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Was it disapproval or just surprise? That piece of information, their new prosperity, their new life built upon the ashes of mine and Lily's, only hardened my resolve. The day of my release, after 7 long, soul-crushing years, was not the joyous occasion one might imagine. There was no one waiting for me at the prison gates, no family, no friends, just the indifferent gray sky of an early spring morning, and a cheap bus ticket to a halfway house in a city I didn't know. I was 65 years old, a convicted felon with no home, no money, and a past that clung to me like a shroud. But I also carried something else, a burning, unquenchable purpose. The grief for Lily was still a raw, open wound, but now it was companioned by a steely determination. The shadow of their accusation had nearly destroyed me, but I had survived. And now I was free. Free to find the truth. Free to unmask the real monster. My first few weeks of freedom were a disorienting blur of navigating a world that had moved on without me. Technology had leaped forward. Social customs had shifted. I felt like a ghost, an anachronism. I found a small, dingy room to rent with, the meager funds I'd earned from prison labor, and a part-time job washing dishes in a greasy diner. It was a harsh, unglamorous existence, a far cry from the comfortable life I'd once known. But every dollar I saved, every hour I worked, was a step closer to my goal. I bought a cheap second-hand laptop and taught myself to navigate the internet, a skill I knew would be crucial. The world was a different place, and I had to adapt if I was to have any chance of uncovering what Sarah and Mark had done. My first concrete step was to try and see Sarah. I needed to look her in the eye, to gauge her reaction after all these years. I found her address in Northwood easily enough. Their house was large, impressive, set back from the road on a manicured lawn. A world away from the small, struggling existence she'd claimed to have when Lily was with her. I remember standing across the street, my heart pounding, watching the house for what felt like hours. Finally, I saw her. She emerged from the front door, dressed in expensive-looking clothes, laughing at something Mark, who followed her out, had said. They looked happy, prosperous, untroubled. There was no sign of the grieving mother I'd seen in the courtroom. She climbed into a sleek new SUV and they drove off, oblivious to my presence. Seeing her like that, so carefree, so untouched by the devastation she had wrought, was like a physical blow. Any lingering foolish hope I might have harbored that she had been a victim too, manipulated by Mark, or that she felt any remorse, died in that moment. The anger, cold and pure, surged through me, solidifying my resolve into something unbreakable. This wasn't just about finding Lily anymore. This was about justice. That image of Sarah, smiling, carefree, became the catalyst. It was the final, irrefutable proof I needed that her grief had been a lie, her accusations a calculated cruelty. It was the point of no return. The time for quiet mourning was over. The time for passive acceptance of my fate was done. Now it was time to act. The timid, heartbroken Eleanor who had been swallowed by the system was gone. In her place was a woman who had nothing left to lose, and a truth that screamed to be told. I knew the path ahead would be difficult, dangerous even. Sarah and Mark had power, money, and a carefully constructed facade of respectability. I had nothing but my conviction and the scars of their betrayal. But I also had Lily's memory, and that, I was beginning to realize, was a formidable weapon. They had underestimated me. They had thought that by locking me away, they had silenced me forever. They were wrong. I started small, meticulously gathering information. I created anonymous social media profiles, piecing together Sarah and Mark's life from their online footprints. They were careful, but not careful enough. Photos from lavish vacations, posts about charity galas, articles celebrating Mark's business successes. A picture of domestic bliss, of a couple who had tragically lost a child years ago, but had bravely moved on. It was all a sickening charade. I cross-referenced names of their friends, their business associates, anyone who might have known them back when Lily disappeared. I spent hours in public libraries, poring over old newspapers from Willow Creek and Northwood, searching for any mention, any forgotten detail. It was slow, painstaking work, often frustrating, often leading to dead ends. But with each small discovery, each piece of the puzzle, However insignificant it seemed, my determination grew. I was no longer just a victim. I was an investigator, hunting for the truth they had tried so desperately to bury. One evening, scrolling through an old online forum for Willow Creek residents, I stumbled upon a faded post from around the time Lily vanished. It was a comment from a woman named Deb, someone I vaguely remembered as a former colleague of Sarah's from a temp job she'd held briefly. The comment was innocuous enough, expressing sympathy for Sarah. But there was a phrase that caught my eye. Sarah always did dream big. Hope this doesn't set her back too much. Dream big. It was such a strange thing to say in the context of a child's disappearance. I managed to track Deb down. She was hesitant to talk at first, wary. But I was persistent, gentle. I didn't accuse. I just asked questions about Sarah, about her ambitions back then. Reluctantly, Deb began to speak. She remembered Sarah complaining constantly about being tied down, about how Lily was cramping her style. She mentioned Mark, how he was older, wealthier, and how Sarah had been utterly infatuated, desperate to impress him, to fit into his world. Deb said, "Mark wasn't exactly the paternal type, if you know what I mean. He made it pretty clear kids weren't in his 5-year plan." Each word from Deb was another nail in the coffin of Sarah's carefully constructed innocence. The monster wasn't just Sarah. It was their shared ambition, their cold, calculated selfishness. And Lily had been the price. Deb's revelations, though painful, were a crucial piece of the puzzle. They confirmed my deepest, most horrifying suspicions. Lily's disappearance hadn't been an accident, and my framing had been a deliberate, calculated act to remove an inconvenient child and an inconvenient witness, me. The image of Sarah, not as a grieving mother but as a cold, ambitious woman willing to sacrifice her own daughter and her own mother for a lifestyle upgrade alongside Mark, began to solidify. It was a monstrous truth, but it was a truth I could now confront head-on, armed with more than just intuition. My investigation, which had been a wide net of desperate searching, now had a much sharper focus. I needed to find concrete proof of their actions, something irrefutable that would pierce through the facade they had so carefully maintained for all these years. My next target became their finances. If Lily had been, as I now suspected, somehow disposed of to clear the path for Sarah and Mark's new life, there would likely be a financial trail, however faint. People like Mark, obsessed with image and control, were often meticulous about money, but also prone to arrogance, to believing they were too smart to be caught. Accessing their financial records directly was impossible for me, a recently released felon with no resources. But I remembered something Brenda had said in prison. Rich folks, they love their paper trails, even when they're doing dirt. They just think no one's smart enough to follow them. I started thinking about the period just before and after Lily vanished. Had there been any unusual expenditures? Any sudden windfalls for Sarah, who had always struggled with money? I spent weeks haunting the public records sections of libraries, learning about property deeds, business registrations, anything that might connect to Mark's financial dealings. It was tedious, often fruitless work. Mark was clever. His businesses were layered through various holding companies, but I was persistent. I recalled Sarah mentioning, in the early days of her relationship with Mark, that he was very particular about his banking, using a smaller local credit union for some of his personal dealings, separate from his main business accounts. It was a long shot, a throwaway comment from nearly a decade ago, but it was all I had. I cross-referenced credit unions in the Northwood area with any public information I could find on Mark. It was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a vast beach. Then a breakthrough, small but significant. I found an old online newsletter from a local Northwood Business Association, dated shortly after Lily's disappearance. It mentioned Mark Miller of Miller Holdings, as a new, generous sponsor for a charity golf tournament. Miller Holdings. That wasn't a company name I'd seen in his more public business profiles. A little more digging online revealed Miller Holdings was a small, privately owned entity with Mark as the sole director, registered to a P.O. box. This felt different, more personal. Could this be connected to the credit union Sarah had once mentioned? I focused my search on credit unions that might have catered to small, local businesses like this supposed Miller Holdings. One afternoon, poring over archived, local news articles on my laptop in my tiny room, I found it. A small-town newspaper from a county adjacent to Northwood ran a human interest story about a local credit union, Oak Ridge Community Credit, celebrating its 50th anniversary. The article listed some of its long-standing business clients. And there it was. Miller Holdings. My heart leaped. It was tenuous, but it was a tangible link. Now, how to access any information? I knew I couldn't just walk in and ask. I needed a way in, a pretext. I thought back to Deb's comments about Sarah wanting a life without Amaras, without ties. Had she liquidated assets around that time? Sold anything of value that might have passed through such an account? I remembered Sarah inheriting a small collection of antique jewelry from her grandmother, my mother. It wasn't worth a fortune, but it had sentimental value. And Sarah had always been dismissive of it, calling it old lady stuff. Had she sold it? And if so, where would the money have gone? It was a thread, however thin. I started researching local antique dealers and jewelers in the Northwood area around the time Lily disappeared. My online searches eventually led me to a retired jeweler, Mr. Abernathy, who had run a shop in Northwood for decades. His shop had closed years ago, but he maintained a small online presence, selling a few remaining pieces from his collection. I contacted him, feigning interest in a piece similar to one my late mother, a carefully constructed persona, had owned. We exchanged a few pleasant emails, and then, carefully, I asked if he ever remembered purchasing a collection of Victorian-era mourning jewelry, perhaps from a young woman, around 8 or 9 years ago. To my astonishment, he replied. He said, "That's a very specific query, madam. I do recall a young woman, quite distressed, who sold a lovely, though perhaps macabre, collection around that time. She said she needed the money urgently, for, a family emergency." My blood ran cold. A young woman, distressed, family emergency. It had to be Sarah. I pressed gently, asking if he remembered her name, or how she was paid. He couldn't recall the name, it was too long ago, but he did remember one detail. "She was very insistent on being paid in cash," he wrote. "Said she didn't want it going through her usual bank. I believe I made the payment out, at her request, as a deposit into an account at Oak Ridge Community Credit, under a business name. Something Holdings, I think. She had the deposit slip all ready. Miller Holdings. Oak Ridge. Cash. My God. Sarah hadn't just wanted to be rid of Lily. She'd been actively liquidating assets, funneling cash through a discreet account, likely one Mark controlled. The pieces were falling into place with a sickening clarity. The sale of the jewelry, the cash payment, the deposit into Miller Holdings via Oak Ridge, it all pointed to a deliberate effort to amass untraceable funds around the time Lily vanished. Why would Sarah need a secret stash of cash if she was just a grieving mother? Why the elaborate charade with a separate credit union and a holding company? It reeked of a payoff, or preparations for a new life built on a foundation of lies. The jewelry itself wasn't a fortune, but combined with other potential sources of cash, it could have been significant. The image of Sarah, tearfully accusing me, now seemed even more grotesque. A cynical performance designed to cover her tracks while she simultaneously feathered her new nest. This discovery, this financial anomaly, was more than just a clue. It was a crack in the very foundation of their carefully constructed alibi. It was the something that didn't add up I had sensed for years, now given a name and a location. The rage I felt was cold, sharp, and utterly focused. They hadn't just taken Lily and my freedom. They had profited from it, using the chaos of my destruction as a smokescreen for their own greedy machinations. The grief for Lily was still there, a constant, aching presence, but now it was intertwined with a burning indignation, a righteous fury that demanded an accounting. They had thought their tracks were covered, that time and my imprisonment had erased their sins. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The mask Sarah had worn for so long was beginning to slip, and I was determined to rip it off completely, no matter what it took. My next step was clear. I had to get closer to Sarah. I had to find a way into her life, into her home, to search for more concrete evidence that would link this financial maneuvering directly to Lily's disappearance. Simply knowing about the Oak Ridge account wasn't enough to bring to the police. I needed something more, something undeniable. This meant I would have to confront her, not with accusations, not yet, but with a facade of my own. I would have to play the part of the broken, remorseful old woman, released from prison, perhaps seeking some sort of reconciliation, or at least a final, quiet understanding before my own time ran out. The thought of feigning forgiveness towards the woman who had orchestrated my ruin, who had quite possibly sold her own child, was nauseating. But it was a necessary evil. I had learned from Brenda that to catch a manipulator, you sometimes had to become one, at least for a little while. I began to craft my approach. I would write her a letter, not sent from my dingy room, but posted from Willow Creek, as if I had returned to the scene of my old life, a broken pilgrim. I would speak of my age, my failing health, a slight exaggeration but plausible, my loneliness, and my supposed acceptance of my role in what happened to Lily. I would not ask for forgiveness, but perhaps for a chance to see her one last time, to make some kind of peace. It was a gamble. Would she see through it? Would Mark, ever the puppeteer, advise her against it? Or would her own arrogance, her belief that I was a spent force, make her careless? I had to try. The stakes were impossibly high, but the thought of Lily, her laughter silenced, her future stolen, spurred me on. The quiet, heartbroken grandmother was about to make a comeback, but this time she had a script of her own. The financial trail, as faint as it was, had given me a direction. It was no longer a matter of if Sarah and Mark were guilty, but how they had done it, and what had truly become of my granddaughter. The sale of the jewelry, the cash, the obscure holding company, these were not the actions of grieving relatives. These were the calculated moves of predators. And I, Eleanor Vance, the woman they had tried to erase, was now hunting them. The fear I had lived with for so long was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a grim, relentless resolve. They had started this, but I was going to finish it. The truth about Lily was out there, and I would tear down every wall, every lie, until I found it. Crafting that letter to Sarah was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Every word felt like a betrayal of Lily, a concession to the monster who had destroyed so much. But I knew it was a necessary charade. I wrote of the long years in prison, of the time I'd had to reflect, of my supposed acceptance of my failings as a grandmother. I didn't grovel, but I allowed a tone of weary resignation, of an old woman seeking a sliver of peace before the end. I mentioned my health was not what it once was. A touch of arthritis, a persistent cough, vague enough to be believable, enough to perhaps elicit a flicker of pity, or more likely, a sense of her own superiority. I didn't ask for forgiveness, knowing that would be a step too far, too suspicious. Instead, I simply expressed a wish to see her, to speak briefly, to close a painful chapter. I posted it from Willow Creek, as planned, hoping the postmark would add a layer of melancholic authenticity. Then came the waiting, each day stretching into an eternity. I replayed the possibilities in my mind. Would she ignore it? Would Mark intercept it and forbid her to respond? Or would some perverse curiosity, some need to see how broken I truly was, compel her to reply? Doubts gnawed at me. Was I being too obvious? Was my desire for justice clouding my judgment, making me reckless? I had to constantly remind myself of Lily, of the smiling face in the faded photograph that was my constant companion. For her, I would walk through fire. For her, I would feign subservience to her own mother. Nearly 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at my drab little room. It was addressed in Sarah's familiar, slightly flamboyant handwriting, a script I hadn't seen in almost a decade. My hand trembled as I opened it. The note was brief, almost curt. She expressed a strained surprise at hearing from me. She wrote that Mark thought it was unwise, but that she, out of some lingering familial obligation, would be willing to meet, briefly, in a public place. She suggested a coffee shop in Northwood, a neutral territory. There was no warmth in her words, no hint of reconciliation, only a wary, reluctant agreement. But it was enough. It was an opening. The first crack in their fortress. Mark's disapproval was a good sign. It meant he was nervous, that he saw me as a potential threat, however small. Sarah's willingness, driven perhaps by a morbid need, to witness my supposed decline, was the leverage I needed. The day of the meeting, I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were neat but deliberately dowdy, an outfit that screamed defeated old woman. I practiced a slight stoop, a hesitant manner of speaking. I had to be utterly convincing. The coffee shop Sarah had chosen was an upscale, trendy place, a world away from the greasy diner where I washed dishes. She was already there when I arrived, seated at a small table by the window, impeccably dressed, her hair perfectly styled. She looked every inch the successful, sophisticated woman she portrayed herself to be. The years had been kind to her, or perhaps money had. There were no visible lines of grief or remorse on her smooth face. Mark was not with her, which surprised me, but also gave me a sliver of hope that I might be able to gauge her reactions more freely. Seeing her up close after all this time was a jolt. This was my daughter, the child I had raised. Yet she felt like a stranger, an alien creature sculpted from ambition and deceit. "Mother," she said, her voice cool, appraising. There was no Eleanor, no mom, just mother, formal and distant. I played my part, offering a weak, tremulous smile. "Sarah, dear, thank you for coming." We ordered coffee, the silence stretching awkwardly between us. I spoke of my release, of my supposed efforts to rebuild a quiet life, of my fading health. I watched her face intently, searching for any flicker of emotion, any crack in the polished veneer. There was nothing. Only a carefully maintained neutrality, a polite, almost bored attentiveness. She offered platitudes about moving on, about how time heals, all while avoiding any direct mention of Lily or the trial. I gently steered the conversation towards my loneliness, my desire for some small connection in my twilight years. I didn't push, didn't accuse. I simply painted a picture of a solitary, regretful old woman. It was a delicate dance, saying, just enough to pique her interest, or perhaps her sense of obligation, without raising her suspicions. "It's just hard," I said, letting my voice crack slightly. "Being all alone, with so many memories." I saw a flicker of something in her eyes then. Not sympathy, but perhaps a calculation. Could she use me? Could a reconciled, remorseful mother be a useful prop in the narrative of her own tragic, yet bravely overcome past? Perhaps, she said slowly, after a long pause. It might be possible for us to see each other occasionally, for a short while. Mark is very protective, you understand. He worries about me being upset. The implication was clear. Any contact would be on her terms, supervised by Mark's unspoken approval. That first meeting was a qualified success. I hadn't gotten any concrete information, but I had established a beachhead. Sarah, either out of a twisted sense of duty, a morbid curiosity, or a calculated assessment of my harmlessness, had agreed to further, albeit limited, contact. Over the next few weeks, we met a few more times, always in public, always with an undercurrent of tension. I continued to play my role, the frail, repentant mother. I listened more than I spoke, absorbing every detail about her life, her routines, her casual mentions of Mark and their home. I learned that Mark traveled frequently for business, leaving Sarah alone in their large house for days at a time. This was a crucial piece of information. An empty house was an opportunity. During one of our meetings, I feigned a dizzy spell. I clutched my head, swayed slightly, making sure Sarah noticed. She reacted with a flicker of annoyance rather than concern, but she did help me to a chair, fussing reluctantly. "You really shouldn't be out on your own if you're feeling unwell, Mother," she said, her tone more irritated than caring. I used the opportunity. "It's just these spells, dear," I murmured. "They come and go. It's probably nothing, but my doctor did say I shouldn't be entirely alone when they happen." I let the implication hang in the air. I was planting the seed, the idea that I might need her, however minimally. It was a loathsome manipulation, mirroring her own tactics, but the stakes were too high for moral scruples. The opening I was waiting for came a few weeks later. Sarah called, her voice unusually flustered. Mark had been called away on an urgent, extended business trip to Asia. She was alone in that big house, and she confessed to feeling a bit nervous. She didn't ask me to stay, not directly. But she did say, it would be reassuring to know someone was nearby, just in case. And then, almost as an afterthought, perhaps you could come for dinner one evening this week, while Mark's away. Just a quiet meal. My heart hammered. This was it. An invitation into their home, an invitation into the lion's den. I accepted with an appropriate display of grateful humility. "Oh, Sarah, that would be lovely. So kind of you." Inside, my mind was racing, planning, preparing. The frail old woman was about to become a Trojan horse. The night I went to their house for dinner, I felt a mixture of dread and grim determination. The house was as opulent as I'd imagined, filled with expensive art and impersonal modern furniture. It screamed of new money, of a life deliberately constructed to erase any trace of a humbler past. Sarah was a tense, slightly distracted hostess. We ate a simple meal she'd clearly had catered, the conversation stilted and superficial. I kept up my facade of gentle frailty, occasionally dabbing at my eyes when I spoke of regrets. After dinner, as I helped her clear the dishes, a task she was clearly unused to, I feigned another more pronounced dizzy spell. This time, I allowed myself to stumble, to lean heavily against the counter. "Oh dear," I gasped. "I think I might need to sit down for a moment. Perhaps I overdid it coming out tonight." Sarah, visibly annoyed but also perhaps a little alarmed at the prospect of me collapsing in her pristine kitchen, reluctantly guided me to a plush armchair in the living room. "Just rest there, Mother," she said, her voice tight. "I'll get you some water." This was my chance. While she was out of the room, my eyes scanned every surface, every bookshelf, every drawer I could subtly reach. I knew I wouldn't find anything incriminating in plain sight. But I was looking for something else. Access. Where did Mark keep his office? Were there any locked rooms? Any hidden safes? My gaze fell upon a small antique writing desk in a shadowed alcove. It was out of place. Amidst the modern decor, almost an afterthought, and it had a locked drawer. My pulse quickened. Why lock a drawer in a house where only she and Mark lived, especially if it was an old, seemingly unimportant piece of furniture? When Sarah returned with the water, I was slumped in the chair, breathing shallowly. "Perhaps," I said weakly, "it might be best if I just rested here on the sofa for the night. I don't think I'm well enough to make the journey back to my little room right now." I saw the conflict in her eyes. Annoyance, suspicion, but also the social awkwardness of turning away her ailing mother. Reluctantly, she agreed, pointing me towards a guest bedroom that felt more like a sterile hotel suite than part of a home. "Try to get some sleep, Mother," she said, her relief at escaping my presence palpable. "We can talk in the morning." As soon as I heard her own bedroom door click shut down the hall, I was up. The real reason for my visit was about to begin. The house was dark, silent, and I had the run of it. My target, Mark's office, and that intriguing locked drawer. The hunt was truly on. Navigating their sprawling, silent house in the dead of night was like walking through a museum of my own betrayal. Every expensive object, every impersonal room, was a testament to the life they had built on the ruins of mine and Lily's. My feigned frailty vanished, replaced by a focused, almost predatory alertness. I moved with a stealth I hadn't known. I possessed, my ears straining for any sound, my slippered feet making no noise on the polished hardwood floors. Mark's office, as I'd guessed from its imposing double doors off the main hallway, was predictably masculine and meticulously organized. Large mahogany desk, leather chairs, shelves lined with business journals and self-important awards. It exuded an air of cold, calculated success. I started with the desk, carefully opening drawers, sifting through papers, invoices, contracts, boring business correspondence. Nothing that immediately screamed kidnapping or child trafficking, but I photographed anything that looked even remotely suspicious with the small, discreet camera pen I'd acquired. The locked drawer in the antique writing desk in the living room alcove, however, drew me back. It felt different, more personal, less a part of Mark's business persona. I had come prepared. In prison, you learn a few things, or you hear about them. Brenda had once casually mentioned how surprisingly easy some old locks were. I had a small set of tension wrenches and picks, acquired discreetly, a skill I'd practiced on discarded locks I'd found. My hands were surprisingly steady as I worked on the old, stiff mechanism. It took several agonizingly long minutes, each tiny click of the tumblers sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Then, a final, satisfying thud. The drawer slid open. Inside, it wasn't filled with business documents or incriminating ledgers. Instead, there was a collection of seemingly random items. A few old, faded photographs that weren't of Sarah or Mark. A child's silver rattle, tarnished with age, a small, velvet-lined box, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. My heart hammered. This felt like a hidden cache of secrets. Perhaps Mark's secrets. Things he kept separate even from Sarah. I carefully lifted the velvet box. Inside, nestled on the satin, was not jewelry, but a collection of small antique toy soldiers, intricately painted. Strange. Then the letters. The handwriting on the envelopes was spidery, old-fashioned, addressed to a Mr. M. Albrecht at an old address in Germany. Albrecht? Not Miller? My confusion deepened. Who was Monsieur Albrecht? I unfastened the ribbon and began to read one of the letters, the paper brittle with age. They were in German, a language I barely understood, but I could pick out a few words. Names? And then I saw it, repeated several times, a woman's name, Liesel. And dates, going back decades. These weren't recent. These were old, very old. I quickly photographed every letter, every envelope, every item in that drawer. The child's rattle, the toy soldiers. What did they mean? It didn't seem to connect directly to Lily, not yet, but it was a hidden life, a secret identity perhaps. Mark Miller, the self-made American businessman, had a past, a German past under a different name, a past he had clearly gone to great lengths to conceal. This was an unexpected detour, but potentially a significant one. A man with a hidden past is a man with vulnerabilities, a man with things to protect. I spent what felt like hours in that house, a ghost sifting through the detritus of their lives. I searched Sarah's closets, her vanity. More expensive clothes, perfumes, but nothing that screamed of a hidden child or a guilty conscience, at least not on the surface. Her life was a testament to superficiality. It was Mark's hidden compartment that held the real intrigue. As dawn approached, I carefully replaced everything in the locked drawer, re-locked it, and tiptoed back to the guest room, my camera pen filled with images, my mind reeling with new questions. Who was Monsieur Albrecht, and what was his connection to the polished, ruthless Mark Miller? Was this a leverage point I could use? The next morning, I played my part to perfection. I was weak, apologetic, profusely thanking Sarah for her kindness. She was clearly eager to be rid of me, her relief palpable when I finally said I felt well enough to go home. "Do take care of yourself, Mother," she said, her voice smooth and insincere as she saw me to the door. I clutched my purse, the camera pen nestled safely inside, and gave her a frail wave. The moment I was out of sight, my posture straightened. My steps firmed. The game had changed. I now had a potential secret weapon against Mark, something he almost certainly didn't know I possessed. Back in my small room, I meticulously reviewed the photographs. The German letters were the key. I found an online translation service, painstakingly typing out the old script. The story that emerged was fragmented, but shocking. The letters were from an elderly woman in Germany, writing to her son, Marcus Albrecht. She spoke of her loneliness, of her fading health, of her memories of little Liesel, Marcus's sister, who had died tragically young in a childhood accident, an accident for which Marcus, then a teenager, had apparently been blamed by some in their family. There were mentions of his difficult upbringing, of his desire to escape his past, to reinvent himself in America. Marcus Albrecht was Mark Miller. He had changed his name, erased his history, and built a new life on a foundation of carefully constructed lies, long before he ever met Sarah, long before Lily. This revelation was a bombshell. Mark wasn't just a greedy, manipulative man. He was a man running from a past filled with tragedy and perhaps guilt. The toy soldiers, the rattle, mementos of a lost sister, Liesel. Did Sarah know any of this? I doubted it. Mark was too controlling, too secretive. This hidden identity, this past trauma, could be a powerful lever. A man who had gone to such lengths to bury his history would be terrified of it being exposed. But how did it connect to Lily? Was there a pattern of behavior? A ruthlessness born from a desire to control every aspect of his new life, to eliminate any potential threat to his carefully crafted persona? My investigation now had two prongs. Sarah's financial dealings around the time of Lily's disappearance, and Mark's hidden German past. I continued to dig into the Oak Ridge Credit Union, trying to find a way to get more information about the Miller Holdings account. It was a brick wall. Without a subpoena, which I, a convicted felon, had no hope of obtaining, direct access was impossible. I needed something more, something that would force their hand or expose them publicly. The German connection felt more promising for leverage. I researched Marcus Albrecht, trying to find any record of him in Germany, any trace of the family he had left behind. It was difficult, with only a common surname and an old address. During this period of intense clandestine investigation, I maintained my frail mother persona with Sarah. We had a few more stilted, uncomfortable meetings. I learned to read her moods, to gauge when Mark was putting pressure on her. She seemed increasingly tense, her composure sometimes cracking. Once, when I gently mentioned how much Lily would have loved a particular brand of ice cream we saw advertised, her face went stark white, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. For a fleeting second, I saw not the cold, calculating, woman, but a flicker of something else. Fear? Regret? It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her usual defensive hauteur. "Please, Mother," she'd snapped. "Don't!" It was a small crack, but it told me the past was not as buried for her as she pretended. The idea of how to use Mark's secret began to form. If I could find a living relative of his in Germany, someone who remembered Marcus Albrecht and the tragedy of Liesel, someone who might be shocked to learn of his new identity and his ruthless business dealings, it could be explosive. I focused my online searches on German genealogy sites, on social media groups for the small town mentioned in the letters. It was a long shot, a digital needle in a haystack. But after weeks of relentless searching, late into the night, fueled by cheap coffee and an unyielding resolve, I found a post on a local German history forum. Someone was asking about the Albrecht family, who had lived on a particular street decades ago. The poster's username was Gisela S. I sent a carefully worded private message to Gisela S., explaining that I was researching a family history and had come across the Albrecht name. I asked if she had any information. Days passed. I had almost given up hope when a reply appeared. Gisela Tass was a distant cousin of Marcus Albrecht's mother. She remembered Marcus, a troubled boy, and the terrible sadness surrounding his little sister, Liesel. She mentioned that Marcus had left for America many years ago and had never been heard from since. His mother had passed away a few years after my release from prison, heartbroken and alone. My heart ached for this unknown woman, another victim, in a way, of Mark's ruthless ambition. Gisela also mentioned that Marcus had an older brother, Stefan, who had also been deeply affected by Liesel's death and Marcus's subsequent abandonment of the family. Stefan, she believed, still lived in a nearby city, Stefan Albrecht. Mark Miller had a brother who almost certainly didn't know his sibling was now a wealthy American businessman living under an assumed name. This was it. This was the leverage I needed. The hidden drawer had yielded its greatest secret. Finding Stefan Albrecht became my singular obsession. Gisela, once she understood I wasn't a threat but someone genuinely seeking information, I carefully omitted my true motives in connection to Mark Miller, provided what little contact information she had for him, an old email address and the city where he last resided. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Crafting an email to a man who didn't know me, about a brother he likely presumed lost or wished to forget, was a delicate operation. I decided on a cautious approach, presenting myself as a historian researching émigrés from their region who had found success in America, and that a Marcus Albrecht, who later changed his name to Mark Miller, had come to my attention. I mentioned his business success and inquired if he might be the same Marcus Stefan knew, subtly hinting at a desire to include his inspiring story in my supposed research. I didn't mention Liesel or Sarah or Lily. I baited the hook with the allure of a successful, reinvented brother. The wait for a reply was agonizing. Days turned into a week. I checked my anonymous email account countless times, my stomach churning with a mixture of hope and dread. What if he didn't reply? What if he wasn't the right Stefan? What if he simply didn't care? Then, one morning, there it was. A short, terse email. "Who is this?" It read in German. "How do you know my brother's name?" The tone was suspicious, guarded, but it was a response. He hadn't denied Marcus was his brother. My heart leaped. I replied immediately, maintaining my academic facade, offering vague details about public business records, and reiterating my innocent historical interest. I emphasized Mark Miller's considerable wealth and standing, hoping to pique his curiosity or perhaps an old resentment. A slow, cautious correspondence began. Stefan was wary, his emails short, his questions pointed. He confirmed Marcus was indeed his younger brother, who had left Germany under a dark cloud many years ago, severing all ties. He spoke with a deep, simmering bitterness about Marcus's abandonment of their grieving mother and the unresolved pain surrounding their sister Liesel's death. He seemed unaware of Marcus's name change or his current level of affluence, speaking of him as if he were still a ghost from a painful past. Each email from Stefan was a carefully hoarded treasure, another piece of the weapon I was forging against Mark Miller. I learned that Stefan was a man of modest means, a retired schoolteacher who had carried the weight of his family's sorrow and his brother's betrayal for decades. He seemed like a mansensa, of integrity, a man who would be appalled by the kind of ruthless ambition Mark had displayed. While this delicate dance with Stefan was unfolding, I continued to maintain my charade with Sarah. My visits to their house, though infrequent, became slightly less supervised. Mark was often away on his business trips I now suspected might also involve managing his carefully concealed past. During one such visit, while Sarah was distracted by a lengthy phone call, I saw my opportunity. I knew I couldn't access Mark's main computer. It would be password protected, and any attempt would be too risky. But in the kitchen, on a small counter, was a family tablet, one they probably used for recipes or casual browsing. It was logged in. With trembling fingers, I opened the web browser. My goal was specific: the Oak Ridge Community Credit Union. I navigated to their online banking portal. Of course, I didn't have a password for Miller Holdings, but sometimes people get careless with less critical shared devices. I checked the browser's saved passwords, and there it was. An entry for Oak Ridge with a username, mhadmin, and a stored password. My breath caught in my throat. It was almost too easy, too careless. I didn't dare log in from their tablet. It would leave a digital trail. But I quickly, carefully, photographed the saved credentials with my camera. Pen. This was a monumental breakthrough. Potential access to the very account I suspected held the key to Lily's disappearance. Back in my room, the ethical dilemma warred with my desperate need for truth. Accessing a bank account illegally was a serious crime. But what about the crime? Committed against Lily? Against me? My resolve hardened. The law had failed me once. I couldn't rely on it now until I had irrefutable proof. With a deep breath, using a public library computer and a VPN for added security, I typed in the Oak Ridge credentials. Access granted. The Miller Holdings account statements were a revelation. It wasn't a bustling business account. Instead, it showed a pattern of sporadic, large cash deposits in the months leading up to Lily's disappearance. And then, a few weeks after she vanished and I was arrested, a series of significant withdrawals, payments made to an entity I didn't recognize. Golden years. Relocation services. Golden years? It sounded benign, like a retirement service. But the amounts were substantial, tens of thousands of dollars. Far too much for any legitimate service Sarah or Mark would have needed at the time. And the timing was chillingly precise. Cash was accumulated before Lily vanished, then dispersed, shortly after I was neutralized. This wasn't just about selling some jewelry. This was a significant sum of money. I searched for Golden Years relocation services. The online footprint was minimal, almost non-existent. A poorly designed website with stock photos of smiling seniors, offering discreet relocation and new identity services for those seeking a fresh start. It screamed of something shady, something designed to operate in the shadows. Relocation. New identity. My blood ran cold. Were they not talking about seniors? Were they talking about children? Could they have used such a service to make Lily disappear, to give her a new identity, to effectively sell her? The horror of that possibility was almost too much to bear, but it fit the financial trail. The accumulated cash for the service, the payments made once Lily was gone and I was out of the way. The final piece I needed was a direct link, a confession, something to tie Sarah and Mark unequivocally to this monstrous act. The financial records were damning, but a clever lawyer might still obscure them. I needed something more personal, more undeniable. And I realized that Stefan Albrecht might be the key, not just to rattle Mark, but to create a situation where Sarah, under extreme pressure, might finally break. I formulated a plan, a desperate high-stakes gamble. I would arrange for Stefan to coincidentally be in Northwood. I would then orchestrate a chance encounter, a confrontation between the two brothers, ideally in Sarah's presence. Mark's carefully constructed world, his American dream built on lies, would come crashing down around him, and in the ensuing chaos, I hoped Sarah's composure would shatter. I emailed Stefan, my tone now more urgent. I told him I had discovered something deeply troubling about his brother Marcus, something that suggested he was involved in unethical, possibly illegal activities, and that his past in Germany was directly relevant. I didn't reveal the full extent of my suspicions about Lily, but I hinted at a darkness that went beyond mere financial impropriety. I told him I believed Mark, was a danger to others, and that his family deserved to know. I offered to pay for his flight to the United States, to arrange accommodation, telling him it was vital he confront his brother for the sake of his family's honor and to prevent further harm. It was a blatant manipulation, playing on his sense of duty and his old wounds, but I justified it as a necessary evil. To my surprise and immense relief, Stefan, after a few more probing questions, agreed. The thought of confronting the brother who had abandoned him, the brother who had apparently prospered while their mother grieved, was a powerful motivator. He was an old man, he said, with little left to lose, and a lifetime of unanswered questions. The day Stefan Albrecht arrived in Northwood, I felt a terrifying mixture of exhilaration and dread. The final act of my long quest for justice was about to begin. I had booked him into a modest hotel, instructing him to wait for my signal. My plan was to ensure Mark was home, then to create a reason for Stefan to appear at their doorstep. I called Sarah, using my ailing mother persona. I told her I was feeling particularly unwell and asked if I could possibly come over for a short while, just to rest, as I was afraid to be alone. I emphasized how much I didn't want to bother Mark, but that I was truly feeling faint. Sarah, with her usual reluctant sigh, agreed, probably eager to get the unpleasant duty over with. She confirmed Mark would be home that evening. The stage was set. That evening, as I sat in Sarah and Mark's opulent living room, feigning weakness, my heart was a jackhammer against my ribs. I had texted Stefan the address and the agreed-upon time. Any minute now, the past Mark had tried so desperately to. Barry would walk through his front door. I made small talk with Sarah, my eyes darting towards the window, towards the front door. Mark was in his study, she said, on an important call. Perfect. Then the doorbell rang. Sarah looked surprised. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked me. I shook my head, my expression one of innocent bewilderment. "Perhaps it's a delivery," she mused, walking towards the hall. I heard her open the door. There was a pause, a confused murmur from Sarah, and then a man's voice speaking in German, firm and resonant. "Ich suche Marcus Albrecht." I am looking for Marcus Albrecht. I heard Sarah's confused reply. I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong house. There's no one here by that name. Then, Mark's voice, sharp, irritated, booming from his study. Sarah, who is it? I'm on a call. He appeared in the hallway, his face a mask of annoyance, which quickly morphed into stunned, disbelieving horror as he saw the tall, grim-faced older man standing in his doorway. Stefan, his past, in the flesh. Marcus? Stefan said, his voice heavy with decades of pain and accusation. Du erkennst deinen eigenen Bruder nicht mehr? You don't recognize your own brother? Mark Miller, or rather Marcus Albrecht, stood frozen, his carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. His eyes darted from Stefan to Sarah, then to me, a wild, trapped animal. The confrontation I had gambled everything on had begun, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the truth about Lily was finally, terrifyingly, within reach. The air in the hallway crackled with a tension so thick it was almost visible. Sarah stood frozen between the two men, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning apprehension, looking from the stranger at the door to her husband, whose face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. Mark, or Marcus, as Stefan had called him, seemed to shrink before my eyes. The confident, ruthless businessman replaced by a cornered, desperate man. Stefan, he finally choked out, his voice barely a whisper, the name an admission. What are you doing here? How did you find me? His American accent, usually so pronounced, seemed to falter, revealing a trace of his native German. How could I not find you, Marcus? Stefan replied, his voice resonating with a cold, righteous anger. He stepped further into the house, his gaze sweeping over the opulent surroundings with a look of profound disdain. When you build your palace on a foundation of lies and forgotten sorrows, did you think your past would simply vanish because you willed it so? Did you think our mother's broken heart would just mend itself? Each word was a hammer blow, visibly shaking Mark. Sarah looked utterly bewildered. Mark, what is he talking about? Who is this man? She demanded, her voice trembling. Mark shot her a venomous glare, a look that clearly said shut up, but his attention was riveted on his brother. This, I said, my voice calm but carrying clearly from the living rooms, is your husband's brother Sarah, Stefan Albrecht, from Germany, the family Mark neglected to mention when he reinvented himself as Mark Miller. Sarah's head whipped around to stare at me, her mouth agape. The accusation in my tone, so different from my usual feigned meekness, clearly startled her. Mark's eyes, burning with a desperate fury, locked onto mine. He knew I was behind this. The pretense was over. You, Mark hissed at me, taking a menacing step forward before Stefan blocked his path. You did this. How dare you meddle in my life? Your life, Stefan interjected, his voice like ice. You call this a life, Marcus? Built on deceit? What about the life you left behind? The mother you abandoned to her grief? What about Liesel? At the mention of his dead sister's name, a flicker of genuine pain, or perhaps fear, crossed Mark's face. Sarah, meanwhile, was looking increasingly frantic. Liesel! Who is Liesel? Mark, what is going on? This was the moment, the chaos, the unraveling. I stood up, no longer feigning frailty, and walked towards them, my gaze fixed on Sarah. Sarah, I said, my voice firm, your husband has been lying to you for a very long time. About who he is, about his past. Just like you've been lying to everyone for a very long time. About Lily. Sarah recoiled as if struck. What? What are you talking about? Lily? How dare you bring her into this? Her voice was high-pitched, defensive. But her eyes darted nervously towards Mark, then back to me. The carefully constructed wall around her was beginning to crumble. "I know about Golden Year's relocation services, Sarah," I continued, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but a whisper that carried the weight of undeniable truth. "I know about the money, the cash you accumulated, the payments you made right after Lily disappeared and I was safely locked away." Sarah's face went ashen. She stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark, seeing her reaction, seemed to deflate, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a look of utter despair. He knew he was caught, exposed on multiple fronts. His past, his carefully guarded secret, was out. And now, his present, his complicity in Lily's fate, was about to be laid bare. "Golden Years," Sarah stammered, her eyes wide with terror. I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do, dear," I said, pressing my advantage. "Discreet relocation, new identities. Was that for Lily? Did you sell your own daughter, Sarah? Did you sell her like a piece of unwanted furniture so you and Marcus here could have your fancy house and your fancy life unencumbered?" The accusation hung in the air, brutal and undeniable. Stefan looked from me to Sarah, then to his brother, his face a mask of dawning horror and revulsion. He was beginning to understand that his brother's deceit ran far deeper than just a name change and an abandoned family. Mark suddenly lunged, not at me but at Sarah. "You stupid, foolish woman," he roared, his voice raw with fury and desperation. "I told you to be careful. I told you no one could ever find out." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in. "Get off me!" Sarah shrieked, trying to pull away, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely. "It was your idea. You said it was the only way. You said she'd have a better life." "A better life?" I interjected, my voice filled with all the pain and rage I had suppressed for years. A better life than with her own mother? Her own grandmother? Or just a life that didn't interfere with your ambitions? It was a confession, blurted out in the heat of their mutual terror and recrimination. "You said she'd have a better life." Sarah had admitted it. Lily wasn't dead. She had been sold, relocated, given a new identity. The pain of that confirmation was a fresh agony, but it was quickly superseded by a cold, triumphant fury. I had them. "It's over, Sarah, Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "It's all over." As if on cue, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance, growing steadily louder. I had made one other call before coming to their house that evening, an anonymous tip to Detective Rodriguez, the young, empathetic officer from Northwood PD I'd tentatively reached out to weeks earlier, with vague concerns about Mark Miller's past and a possible cold case. I'd told her I might have more information soon and asked her to be in the vicinity. The confrontation with Stefan was designed not just to break them, but to ensure the authorities would be close by when the dam finally burst. The flashing, blue and red lights washed over the expensive drapery in their living room. Mark and Sarah froze, their faces illuminated in the stark, unforgiving strobes. The fight was gone, replaced by a dawning, sickening realization of their predicament. Stefan Albrecht stood apart, watching his brother, his expression one of profound sorrow and disgust. He had come seeking answers about his past and had stumbled into a nightmare far more depraved than he could have imagined. Detective Rodriguez, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, was at the door, which Sarah had left ajar in the chaos. "Mr. Miller? Mrs. Miller?" Rodriguez's voice was calm but firm. "We received a call. Seems there's quite a disturbance." She took in the scene. Stefan, stern and accusatory. Mark, pale and trembling. Sarah, now openly weeping, a broken, pathetic figure. And me, Eleanor Vance, standing amidst the wreckage of their lives, no longer a victim, but the architect of their downfall. "Actually, Detective," I said, meeting her gaze, "I believe it's Mr. Albrecht you should be addressing, and I have a great deal to tell you about him, about his wife, and about my granddaughter, Lily, who, it turns out, isn't dead after all." The next few hours were a whirlwind of official procedure, played out against the backdrop of Sarah's hysterical sobs and Mark's stony, defeated silence. I laid out everything: the financial trail, the Miller Holdings account, the payments to Golden Years relocation services, Mark's hidden identity as Marcus Albrecht, the letters from his mother, the existence of Stefan. I had my camera pen, with its trove of photographed evidence, and I had Stefan, a living testament to Mark's lifelong deceit. Sarah, completely undone, confessed everything to Detective Rodriguez, implicating Mark as the primary instigator but admitting her own willing participation. She claimed they'd convinced themselves Lily would be better off with a wealthy, childless couple willing to pay a great deal for a healthy child, and that Golden Years had assured them it was all discreet and above board, a lie she had clearly chosen to believe. Mark, confronted with Stefan's presence and Sarah's confession, offered no resistance. His empire of lies had crumbled. As they were led away in handcuffs, Sarah cast one last, desperate look at me, her eyes pleading. But there was no pity left in my heart for her, only a vast, aching emptiness where my love for my daughter had once resided, and a fierce, protective surge of emotion for the granddaughter I now knew was alive, somewhere out there, living a life built on a terrible secret. Stefan watched his brother go, his face etched with a profound sadness. He came over to me, placing a hesitant hand on my arm. "Frau Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What he did, what they did, there are no words. My family owes you a debt." I simply nodded, too exhausted, too overwhelmed to speak. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. The media descended, of course, the story of the resurrected grandmother who had solved her own granddaughter's disappearance and exposed a web of deceit, becoming a local, then national sensation. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the convicted felon, the negligent granny. I was a symbol of resilience, of a mother's, or grandmother's, unwavering fight for truth. It was a strange, disorienting reversal of fortune. The community of Willow Creek, those who had whispered and judged, were now effusive in their apologies, their admiration. I accepted their words with a polite, distant civility. Their opinions no longer mattered to me. All that mattered was Lily. The authorities, armed with Sarah's confession and the financial records, began to unravel the network of Golden Years relocation services. It was, as I suspected, a front for an illegal child trafficking ring, specializing in providing children to wealthy, unscrupulous clients, complete with falsified documents and new identities. It was a sickening, depraved enterprise, and Sarah and Mark were just one small, albeit particularly cruel, cog in its monstrous machine. The investigation would be long and complex, but the process of finding the children they had victimized, including Lily, had begun. For me, the public vindication was secondary. The true victory was the knowledge that Lily was alive. The years of believing her dead, of carrying that unbearable guilt, had been a torment. Now, there was a new torment. The uncertainty of her current life. The pain of knowing she had been raised by strangers, her entire history a lie. Detective Rodriguez assured me they would do everything in their power to locate her, to ensure her safety and well-being. The legal process to untangle her situation, to perhaps even allow contact, would be fraught and lengthy, she warned. Lily, or whatever name she now went by, was a teenager, nearly 14. She would have a life, a history, memories with another family. The thought was a fresh wave of grief. But beneath it, there was also a fragile, tenacious shoot of hope. She was alive, and that was everything. The monster who was her mother and the monster her mother had married were finally facing justice. And I, Eleanor Vance, had brought them down. My fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The fight for Lily was just beginning. But I had won the first, most important battle. I had found the truth. The months that followed were a strange blend of public attention and private anticipation. The trials of Sarah and Mark, or rather Marcus Albrecht, were swift, given Sarah's comprehensive confession and the mountain of evidence I, with Stefan's corroboration, had provided. Mark's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely under the weight of his exposed past and his undeniable involvement in the scheme to sell Lily. He was revealed not just as a manipulative spouse and a financial predator, but as a man, capable of shocking cruelty, willing to destroy lives to protect his fabricated identity and secure his material comforts. Stefan's testimony about Mark's abandonment of his German family and the tragic circumstances surrounding their sister Liesel's death, which it was hinted Marcus may have had a more direct, though perhaps accidental, hand in than previously known, painted a picture of a lifelong pattern of selfishness and evasion. He received a lengthy sentence, befitting his crimes. Sarah's fate was more complex. Her defense portrayed her as a victim of Mark's manipulation, a weak woman swayed by a dominant older man. There was some truth to that, perhaps, but it didn't absolve her of her own choices, her own active participation in selling her daughter and framing her mother. Her tearful apologies in court rang hollow to me. She was sentenced to a shorter term than Mark, but significant nonetheless. As she was led away, she looked directly at me, her eyes filled with a desperate plea for a forgiveness I could not, would not, offer. My heart was a stone when it came to Sarah. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too grievous. Perhaps one day, far in the future, some semblance of pity might surface, but not then. Not for a long time. The operators of Golden Year's relocation services were also apprehended, their network dismantled, and the slow, painstaking process of identifying and attempting to reunite the stolen children with any remaining innocent family members began. For me, the legal battles were a sideshow. My entire being was focused on one thing: Lily. Detective Rodriguez kept me informed. They had located her. She was living in California under the name Sophie Miller. A cruel irony, Mark having given her his stolen surname, with a wealthy, older couple, the Prestons, who had apparently paid a considerable sum to Golden Years. The Prestons, it seemed, may have been duped into believing it was a legitimate, albeit discreet, adoption, though investigations into their culpability were ongoing. The news that Lily or Sophie was safe and well cared for, at least physically, was an immense relief. But it also opened a new chapter of pain and complexity. The authorities initiated contact with the Prestons, explaining the situation. The fallout was, as expected, traumatic for everyone involved, especially for Sophie. Her entire life, her identity, her understanding of who she was, had been built on a lie. She was not the biological child of the people who had raised her. Her birth mother had sold her. Her grandmother had been falsely imprisoned. It was a truth almost too monstrous for a young teenager to absorb. I ached for her, for the confusion and pain she must be experiencing. I wrote her a letter, with the help of child psychologists assigned to her case. I didn't demand anything, didn't try to reclaim her. I simply told her who I was, how much I had loved her as Lily, how I had never stopped thinking of her, and how desperately sorry I was for the horrors she had been unknowingly subjected to. I told her I was her grandmother, and that if and when she ever felt ready, I would be waiting. The waiting was another kind of prison. Weeks turned into months. I threw myself into volunteer work, helping at a center for victims of wrongful convictions. Sharing my story, helping others navigate the labyrinth of the legal system, gave me a sense of purpose, a way to channel the roiling emotions that still threatened to overwhelm me. I received occasional updates from Detective Rodriguez. Sophie was in therapy, struggling to come to terms with the truth. The Prestons were cooperating, devastated, and reportedly remorseful for their naivete or willful blindness. The legalities of her situation were complex, given her age and the length of time she had lived with them. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year after Sarah and Mark's arrest, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. I answered, my heart suddenly pounding. Hello? A young woman's voice, hesitant, soft. Is this Eleanor Vance? Yes, I breathed, my hand gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles were white. Yes, it is. There was a pause then. This is Sophie. Sophie Miller. Or, I guess, Lily. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring my vision. I sank into the nearest chair, unable to speak for a moment. Lily, I finally whispered, the name a prayer on my lips. Oh, my dear girl. Our first conversation was tentative, filled with long silences and unspoken emotions. She had so many questions, so much confusion. I answered as honestly, as gently as I could. I didn't speak ill of Sarah beyond the necessary facts. Sophie would have to process that betrayal in her own time. I focused on my love for her, on the happy memories I cherished of our time together when she was little Lily. We talked for over an hour. And at the end, she said, the psychologists think maybe it would be okay if we met, if you wanted to. Wanted to? It was all I had dreamed of for 9 agonizing years. Our first meeting was arranged at a neutral location, a quiet park, with her therapist present at a discreet distance. When I saw her walking towards me, a tall, lovely young woman with eyes so like my own, so like the Lily I remembered, my breath caught in my throat. She was a stranger, yet intimately familiar. We sat on a bench, much like the one in Willow Creek all those years ago, and we talked. She told me about her life as Sophie, about the Prestons, who, despite the deceit of their acquisition, had clearly loved her in their own way. I told her about my life before, about my garden, about the books we used to read. There were tears, from both of us. There was awkwardness, but there was also a connection, a fragile thread reaching across, years of separation and lies. It wasn't a fairy tale reunion. There was no instant, magical return to the past. She was Sophie, and the life she had known for a decade couldn't be erased. I was Eleanor, a grandmother she was only just beginning to know, a grandmother who carried the scars of an immense injustice. But as we parted that day, with a hesitant hug and a promise to talk again soon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known since that terrible afternoon in the park. The journey ahead would be long, building a new relationship, helping her navigate the complexities of her dual identity, her feelings towards Sarah, towards the Prestons. It would take time, patience, and a great deal of love. My life now is quiet, but it is my own. I moved from that dingy room into a small, sunny apartment with a little balcony where I can grow flowers. Stefan Albrecht, after testifying against his brother, returned to Germany, but we correspond occasionally. 2 souls bound by an unlikely tragic connection. He is trying to find peace with his family's fractured past. I still volunteer at the support center. My story, once a source of private agony, now offers hope to others. Sometimes, when I'm alone, the weight of the lost years, the phantom ache of Lily's stolen childhood, still presses down on me. The scars will always be there, but they no longer define me. They are a testament to survival, to the enduring power of truth. And Lily, or Sophie, we are finding our way. We talk regularly. She has visited me. I have shown her photographs of her as a baby, told her stories of her early years. She is slowly, cautiously, piecing together the parts of herself that were stolen. There is no simple resolution, no neat ending to a story as tangled and painful as ours. But there is hope. There is the possibility of healing. And there is the quiet, profound satisfaction of knowing that the monsters who tried to destroy us, who built their happiness on our pain, are now paying for their crimes. They called me a monster, a negligent crone. They tried to bury me under their lies. But they underestimated the strength of a grandmother's love and the relentless pursuit of truth. My name is Eleanor Vance, and this is my story. The story of how I was framed, how I fought back, and how, against all odds, I found my way back to the light, bringing the truth with me. Life can deal us unimaginable blows, and sometimes the fight for truth feels impossible. But if my story has resonated with you, if you believe in the power of resilience and the ultimate triumph of justice, perhaps you'll consider subscribing. There are more stories to be told, more voices that need to be heard. Thank you for listening.